is Canada finally cutting the anchor with the United States, or are we just building a multi-billion-dollar lifeboat before the trade war sinks us both?
While Donald Trump is busy threatening to tariff our allies into oblivion over a Greenland land grab and vowing to steamroll our economy because we won't hand him ownership of the Gordie Howe Bridge, Mark Carney has stopped playing nice. Instead of pleading for mercy, he's going behind Washington's back to build a global economic shield that renders Trump's threats irrelevant.
This week, Carney took two giant steps at once to make that shield a reality. First, he officially signed us on to SAFE, Europe's massive €150 billion weapons fund that cuts our dependence on US weapons. Second, he activated one of the biggest trade alliances on Earth, linking Europe and the Indo-Pacific into a 1.5 billion person buffer against Washington's coercion.
Oh, and in the middle of all of that, Ottawa dropped a leaked $6.6 billion defense industrial strategy that is a total rupture. The goal? Ottawa says they want 70% of all defense contracts to stay with Canada firms. That is a massive jump from the current status quo, where 75 cents of every capital dollar we spend goes straight to the United States.
Carney is effectively firing American contractors to build our own kit at home. The message is clear. We're done sending 3/4 of our defense money to American contractors. We'll build our own kits, thanks. Well, grab a coffee, everybody, because this is the biggest strategic pivot Canada's made in our lifetime, and Trump is absolutely gonna hate it.
Let's start with the part Trump will notice first. The mega alliance in London, Brussels, Singapore, pick a capital. Officials are quietly talking about a plan that sounds like a complete rewriting of the world order. A deal so massive it effectively erases the US border from the global supply chain. The European Union and the CPTPP bloc, and that is Canada, Japan, Australia, Mexico, Vietnam, and friends, while they're exploring a deal to link their supply chains.
This is about rules of origin, the paperwork that decides what passport a product carries. You knit those systems together and suddenly a battery cell partly made in Quebec, finished in Japan, can move into Europe like it was made there all along with minimal tariffs.
And why does that matter? Because Trump has turned tariffs into his primary weapon of economic warfare.
Now, enter Carney at Davos. He tells the room that so-called middle powers are done just absorbing blows from superpowers. Canada, he says, is trying to build a bridge between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, tying together nearly 40 countries, 1.5 billion people into one giant economic buffer.
But it's not just about rules of origin. It's about a complete shift in attitude. He used a line that is now echoing from Singapore to Brussels. He told the global elite, the middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
By stitching together this alliance with Japan, Australia, and the EU, Carney is trying to build a table so big that Trump can't flip it. And it's working. While Trump is busy threatening to tariff Denmark over Greenland, Carney has signed 12 trade deals and security deals across 4 continents in just 6 months. He's not ignoring Washington, he's out hustling them.
And he doesn't just talk, he sends his man to Singapore, John Hannaford, the man who used to run the entire federal civil service, to quietly test the waters with the CPTPP members on this original deal. Officials from Canada, Japan, and others are now admitting the talks are happening.
If this works, it means something very simple. If Trump slams the door on Canadian exports, there's another door. Maybe not as big, but enough that we're not stuck begging Washington to reopen the first one.
Carney knows a trade shield is useless if your national security is still owned by the person threatening you. You can't declare economic independence on Monday while writing billion-dollar checks to the Pentagon on Tuesday.
Exactly. This isn't just a trade pivot, it's a total strategic divorce. And that brings us to the part that really freaks out old-school foreign policy people. Carney isn't just building a trade wall around Trump's tariffs. He's starting to move Canada's actual weapons spending away from the US machine.
And this brings us to Munich and this lovely new acronym, SAFE. SAFE stands for Security Action for Europe, a €150 billion European Union fund that gives low-interest loans to countries so they can buy more weapons and gear, mostly from European manufacturers. It's basically saying, Europe can't rely on whoever's in the White House anymore, and we need our own arsenal.
But here is the cool part for Canada. Britain isn't even in it. Starmer tried to negotiate his way in last year, but Brussels, they slammed the door, demanding a €6 billion entrance fee that the UK couldn't afford.
And yet, here comes Mark Carney. While the UK is locked out and Trump is lecturing allies about paying up, Canada just crashed the party. We officially signed on to SAFE this weekend as the first and only non-European member. And the price tag? A measly €10 million. Carney basically got us a VIP pass to the European defense market for the price of a mid-sized condo in Toronto.
That gives Canadian defense firms access to the European joint procurement market and lets Canada co-fund big projects with the EU countries instead of just writing checks to US suppliers.
Carney has flat out said that 75 cents of every Canadian defense capital dollar going to the United States isn't smart, and that we need made-in-Canada manufacturing and supply chains. SAFE is the first step in moving that money to our own backyard and to our new partners in Europe.
This means instead of just buying finished American hardware, Canada can plug into European projects like ships, air defense, maybe next-generation fighters. With Canadian production that is built right into the contracts. We aren't just buying weapons anymore. We're building a supply chain that Washington can't touch.
And that brings us to the bomb that leaked this week, the Defense Industrial Strategy, the thing that ties all of this together. On paper, it looks like a standard white paper, but it's actually a $6.6 billion Trojan horse that stops a total-led takeover of our economy.
Yep, the leaked document lays out a $6.6 billion plan over the next decade to rebuild Canada's defense industry at home. The headline numbers? 70% of defense procurement contracts to Canadian firms, 125,000 new jobs, and a big jump in exports, up by roughly 50% by 2035.
Right now, depending on how you count, roughly half of our contracts go abroad. In capital spending, Carney says 3/4 of that cash flows south. The new strategy basically says, flip that. Spend the majority here and use what you can to build here to lock in deeper partnerships with Europe and allies in the Indo-Pacific, not just the States.
The core idea is a build, partner, buy order. First choice, build in Canada, especially in areas that strategy calls sovereign capabilities. Things like aerospace, ammunition production, sensors, drones, and specialized vehicles that we already have real capacity in. Second choice, build jointly with trusted allies. Only as a last resort do you go out and buy something off the shelf from abroad.
There's a reason the aerospace is at the top of that list. That's where the F-35s live. Canada is still technically on path to buy F-35s from the US, but look at the bigger picture. Ottawa just signed into SAFE, where European fighter makers are circling. Reuters has already reported that the government is reassessing the F-35 plan, with Sweden's Gripen being floated again because it comes with offers of local production in Canada.
So imagine you're in a cabinet room. On one side, an American jet that locks you into US supply chains for decades, from software to spare parts. On the other side, the chance to build a big chunk of a European system here, funded partly by EU loans with Canadian jobs and intellectual property baked in.
The Defense Industrial Strategy doesn't scream, cancel the F-35s in big red letters, but putting aerospace at the top of the sovereignty list and signing into a European defense fund days before releasing this plan, well, it's not an accident. We are now 10 years late getting these jets into the air, and the costs have exploded by 50%, up to nearly $28 billion. Even the planes we've paid for are stuck in a software trap in the States because the Block 4 upgrades are a total wreck. A strategy on paper doesn't magically fix a decade of lighting taxpayer money on fire.
Exactly, and that is why Carney is blowing up the old way of doing business. He knows that we can't fix a 2026 trade war with 1990s administrative strangleholds. While the conservatives want to cut the red tape, well, the NDP is currently screaming at Carney to stop half measures and kill the American F-35 contract entirely.
The NDP's solution? The Swedish Saab Gripen. And honestly, most Canadians are right there with them. A massive poll just dropped showing that 72% of us want the Gripen in our fleet, while only a tiny 13% sliver still thinks that the F-35 is our only option. The NDP are pointing out that Sweden, a fellow middle power, is offering to build the jets right here in Canada, creating 12,000 jobs. To the NDP, and clearly to the public, this is a no-brainer.
They're calling the F-35 a sovereignty killer because the US maintains total control over the software. Why are we giving billions to Lockheed Martin when they can effectively ground our planes whenever Trump has a bad day? It just doesn't make sense. So, let's talk about how Carney plans to actually spend that $6.6 billion without it getting swallowed by the usual Ottawa red tape. He's launching a standalone powerhouse called the Defense Investment Agency, or the DIA.
The DIA is essentially a war room for procurement. Its job isn't to write reports, it's to pick national champions. These are Canadian companies that can actually build what we need on time, or they lose their funding.
The new agency is bypassing the standard bidding process for what they call sovereign capabilities. So, if you're a Canadian company building drones for the Arctic or ammunition for our allies, Carney is writing you a check directly. It's a total move away from their fair and open competition that usually ends up with us buying American anyway.
Carney is betting $6.6 billion that Canadian industry can replace the U.S. supply chain before Trump's next term is up.
But then there's the money, right? The government is talking about getting to 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. That's a massive jump. The $6.6 billion industrial strategy is carved out of a broader $80 billion plus defense reinvestment plan from the last budget. Now, if that cash gets squeezed by some future round of cuts, well, then this whole strategy risks becoming another glossy PDF sitting in a file folder.
So there are real risks. You can build a domestic industry that still can't deliver on time. You can chase sovereignty and still end up with small budget Canadian equipment that's more expensive and arrives late while other allies move faster.
But there's also the flip side. Staying on the old path has its own risk, right? In the last decade, over 70% of our capital defense spending flowed to the US. Trump, now he's openly using economic pressure on allies, weaponizing tariffs, and threatening infrastructure like the Gordie Howe Bridge whenever it suits his politics. At some point, business as usual turns into self-sabotage.
So let's zoom out and look at the map Carney is sketching.
Yeah, on one side, you've got trade. Canada as the bridge between the EU and the Indo-Pacific, the country that can move goods, resources, and technology across a 1.5 billion person marketplace that's trying to insulate itself from Trump's terror storms.
On the other side, you've got defense. Canada as the only non-EU country inside SAFE, that European Defense Loan Program, with access to joint projects and contracts that don't run through Washington. If this works, a Canadian armored vehicle or radar system or drone might be built in partnership with Denmark or Spain instead of exclusively with American primes.
Now, overlay those two moves, and you get a very different picture of Canada than the one that we grew up with. Not the polite junior partner standing quietly behind the US in every photo, but a middle power that treats Washington as one relationship among several. It's important, but it's not exclusive.
Of course, this won't feel like a clean break either. The strategy itself says that Canada is still committed to a strong defense relationship with the United States. We've got NORAD, NATO, cross-border logistics. These don't disappear overnight, but they stop being the only options.
Think of it this way. For decades, our security model was, hey, if things go bad, the Americans will show up with the gear, the planes, and the money. Now we're living in a time when the American president openly threatens allies, flirts with autocrats, and treats trade like a loyalty test. So in that world, clinging to the old model isn't friendship or loyalty, it's denial.
The real test isn't a press conference next week. It's whether 5 years from now, Canadian sailors have ships that actually work, pilots have planes that aren't stuck in hangars, and welders in Halifax and Winnipeg, well, they're building gear that is stamped made in Canada and is actually going to Latvia.
So we want to hear from you on this. Is Carney finally drawing a line between Canada's security and Trump's temper? Or is this just another glossy strategy that's going to die in committee?
Drop a comment with the word sovereign in it if you think Canada should push ahead with this build-at-home partnership with Europe path, or if you think we should still keep most of our kit coming from the United States. Tell us why.
And as always, if you found this breakdown useful, hit like so more people see it, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with that one friend who still thinks Canada has no choice but to do whatever Washington wants.
We'll keep digging through the leaks, the trade deals, and the fine print so you don't have to. And we're writing about it more over on our Substack. So check that out. And while you're checking out the links below, we've got new merch dropping, and you can join the A-Team to help keep this channel independent.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and hey, we'll see you tomorrow.